So let's get started. Frank, so I want to introduce our speakers today, Clay Schneider and Frank. Clay is a PG. He's a district manager for W&M Braun here in Dallas. He has a BA in environmental science from Tarleton. Is it Tarleton or Tarleton? Tarleton. Tarleton. They're big rodeo guys, aren't they? No?
Yeah, I believe they are.
Okay. Wake up. He has over 60 experience with site characterization remedies and closure investigations. Currently manages the staff of scientists and engineers who focus on investigation and remediation in contaminated soil and groundwater. And Frank is a PG, project engineer, professional engineer, and professional geologist. Is that right?
Geoscientist.
Geoscientist. Are you a geologist? But that's a geologist, right? You're not.
No.
This whole time I thought you were a geologist, so I guess you're not as big of a nerd as I thought you were. So there, I'm just teasing. He has a BS in civil engineering from Tufts University. He has a master's in geotechnical engineering from MIT. Project manager or director of over 1,200 environmental engineering projects throughout the Northeast and Southwest United States and in Europe. Now, one of these days we'll have to talk about that Europe site. That sounds pretty interesting. So Frank, are you starting us today?
Yeah, we're ready to go. Yeah.
So that's usually how I feel at the beginning of every webinar. So take it away.
Yeah, hopefully you all can hear us. That's partly what that picture's there for too. For the agenda this morning, we'll briefly go through the nature of contamination on sites, but that's really not the focus. I imagine many of you are familiar with that. And then we'll really get into the approaches for dealing with contaminated sites once you find that you have an issue. As many of you know, since the 1980s, title companies and lenders have required phase 1 environmental site assessments on commercial properties. Now, initially that process was very erratic in nature and confusing, but eventually with the advent of the ASTM standard for phase 1 site assessments, which was most recently updated in 2013, there is now a very well-defined process for evaluating the presence of what we call recognized environmental conditions. And once you find a wreck on a property, that will often initiate or result in the initiation of site investigations that could discover contamination in the areas of concern. Now, in the past 30 years, we have learned quite a bit about nature and sources of environmental contamination, some expected and other a little surprising. Some sources of contamination are quite obvious, such as spills of liquid onto the ground surface or solid wastes, etc. Others, however, are less obvious, such as the fact that we have all learned that even well-constructed underground storage tank systems can often leak, not so much due to leaks in the tank itself, but sometimes leaks in the piping or in dispenser connections. So plumbing ends up being a major factor with releases from tank systems. We also learned that dry cleaning solvents are rather nefarious, and even though we used to not be concerned if dry cleaning solvent was spilled onto a concrete surface, we now know that these chemicals have a way of seeping through concrete and cracks and joints and resulting in contamination of underlying soil and groundwater. So dry cleaners are a major source of contamination today. We also learned that urban pollution from a number of common day sources are creating contamination on properties. For example, lead emitted from leaded gasoline from automobile exhausts, and even agricultural activities where historical use of pesticides that contained arsenic, for example, have been discovered in sites that would be otherwise unremarkable. The next few slides will just show a few examples of things that we typically see during phase 1 site assessments that result in the definition of a wreck and they're eventually into possibly phase 2 sampling. Drums are in a way, the poster child of environmental contamination. Whenever we see a drum, we're concerned about what's in it.
Or what was in it.
What was in it. Often contain one product when they arrive on site and then are used for waste products later because they're convenient for that purpose. So here we have an auto repair facility on the left, and we see drums buried behind mountains of auto parts, probably haven't been touched in years, probably containing waste oils or waste solvents. Other drums stored on pallets, but with evidence of leakage, and then just drums out in the back 40 where they've been sitting there for possibly years or decades, containing fluids which will eventually leak. And a prime example of that will be this next slide, which I love because it shows exactly how vulnerable 55-gallon drums are to deterioration.
Is that a pony in the back?
That is a miniature pony. Yeah.
That picture has a little bit of everything.
Bicycle.
Jeez.
This site was a veritable circus, but these were drums of waste cuttings from soil borings that a consultant had left on a site, and then the client went bankrupt, the site transferred ownership, everyone forgot that the drums were there, and they sat there fallow for years and years and years. And you can see the deterioration of the drums and the holes. And the one that really gets me is the one on the far right, where that drum literally deteriorated to the point where it collapsed upon itself into the ground. The entire bottom half of the drum is disintegrated. And so these are samples of how stuff gets into the ground surface.
That looks like a scene out of Mad Max. And okay, so I see a lot of rust. Is that, if you see a lot of rust on the ground, would that be a wreck, or that's just something that's
not necessarily?
Okay.
No, it would be in the absence of. You want to look for sources of chemicals that would be in the rust, but we know that some of the soils can be corrosive, and with the presence of moisture, that will create these types of conditions.
Okay, I do have two questions. Did you ride the bike to the site? Whose bike was that?
The company truck was unavailable that day, and
did you pet the pony? All right.
So other sources of contamination, again, auto repair shops. Often these are small mom and pop operations. The procedures for understanding and managing wastes and fluids, automotive fluids, is just not well established. So we often see poor housekeeping practices in these types of facilities that result in opportunities for automotive fluids to get into the ground surface. On the right is an abandoned dry cleaner that was returned back to the owner. When the owner visited the property after the tenant left, he found this little surprise, a drum of waste perc solvent that he had to deal with. And of course, when we studied this site, we did find contamination. So dry cleaners have become a major source of contamination. I think one major reason is we didn't understand the dangerousness of the chemicals, and a lot of the operations were run by small businesses which really were not up to speed on current practices for managing this type of chemical.
And so, I mean, is there limits on now that you're allowed to use perc, or is that still allowed, or is it?
It's allowed, but now there's a significant tax on the use of perc, and so it's discouraged. And most dry cleaners trying to go to more environmentally friendly solvents and avoid the use of perc. It's just become too costly to purchase and too costly to dispose of the waste.
Because once it gets down or in the concrete or the drain, it spreads fast.
It does. The cleanup concentrations are very low, so it doesn't take very much to create a problem.
So have you ever heard, we have a property with a dry cleaner, but it's a clean dry cleaner.
Right.
Yeah. So
yes, every owner of a property like that swears to that. Mm-hmm. And finally, everyone is familiar with the problems with underground storage tanks. And today, everyone goes to massive filling stations that have dozens and dozens of pumps and 3 or 4 state-of-the-art fiberglass underground tanks. But back in the 1930s to 1950s, a lot of these filling stations were mom-and-pop operations on a street corner with maybe one dispenser and one underground tank. And they literally, if you look on historical Sanborn maps, you'll see them on pretty much every street corner. Then when the use of this property changed, it went from being a gas station perhaps to an insurance agency. They basically abandoned the site and left the tank in the ground. And so we still, to this day, are finding underground storage tanks all the time. This site on the right was a ghost tank found literally underneath the sidewalk in front of a former car dealer. in an urban area, and it's literally that excavation goes from the sidewalk out into the street, and that's where these tanks were located. And there are still probably hundreds of them out there.
You know, I had a experience with a ghost tank when we were building this site in Commerce, and we were during construction, and we hit one, and then it was just you had to stop,
Yeah.
and then we found two, and then that was like it was just because you can't just take them off and haul them away. You have to find somebody that can take them, right?
That's right. It has to be done by a licensed company, etc.
Hopefully we did that. So
all right, we won't ask you any more questions about that.
I had a project manager that we did that.
Okay. So when so if you do find contamination on your property, what do you do? Obviously, you want to understand the nature of the source of that contamination and find out what is the best, most appropriate regulatory program for you to enter into. Sometimes it'll be obvious, but there are, we've listed here the 5 principal programs that we use or are used in Texas to deal with contaminated sites: leaking tank program, voluntary cleanup, corrective action, and then innocent owner and dry cleaner. So we'll run through each of these briefly and talk about how they work and some of the tools that are available or some of the benefits of each one. And we'll also talk about something that is not really a program, but municipal setting designations. Clay will talk about that and how they can be used to help close sites. So what are the big, just to set the stage, what are the big challenges with regard to cleanup? First of all, in the state of Texas, we presume that all groundwater should be suitable for potable purposes. That is the default position, and that makes eminent sense. The state wants to protect the environment and make everything suitable for its highest use. Secondly, when the state develops cleanup standards for many media, in particular soil, they had to develop these using conservative assumptions because it's a very large state. Geologic and hydrologic conditions are very different. So cleanup standards for soil, for example, often are based upon leaching of contaminants into a shallow groundwater table. They're based on relatively pervious soils that allow leachate, and they're based on maybe higher rainfall than you would typically find in areas. So rainfall in East Texas will be much higher than rainfall in Midland or Lubbock. But that is what obviously we had to do in order to come up with a standard that everyone could start with. And so we have very conservative numbers to begin with. Thirdly, groundwater issues are most often drive the remediation of a site. And fourth, we have found that the cost for cleanup of sites to background values, which was where we tried to do it back in the 80s before we had a lot of state standards established. We found that really that's become impractical, sometimes impossible technically, and very often too burdensome for most sites to bear in terms of cost.
So, Frank, if you have a site it's contaminated, is it by definition your groundwater is going to be contaminated too, or it just depends on if you?
It depends, but we find depending upon the contaminant, some contaminants such as metals tend to bind up in soil. PAHs will bind up in soil and not leach to groundwater. Others, such as organic compounds, leach very readily to groundwater. So it depends on the type of contaminant.
And maybe how deep or shallow the water would be.
Is.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah. So this is really the focus of what we wanted to talk about, some of the risk-based cleanup options. And this means that we're not going to clean up these sites to background values, but we're going to use an approach that says if the risk is acceptable, then we don't need to clean up to a higher level than that. And here are some of the typical approaches we use. The first one has to do with background conditions. I mentioned heavy metals from urban pollution. We often find heavy metals such as lead, arsenic, and mercury in surface soils. And if you are in an urban area and it is subject to airborne deposition from industrial sources, then if you can establish a background value for those metals, then you would not have to clean up to a level lower than those background values. A prime example of that would be for the listeners who are familiar with the Dallas area. There was a smelter located in West Dallas that operated for decades and resulted in airborne lead smelter emissions across large swaths of West Dallas. In fact, the area that EPA defined as over 13 square miles of area that could be contaminated with lead. So this is an example of urban deposition to the max, and that is a tool that we can use if we know where we are and we can determine a background concentration. We can eliminate maybe some cleanup of a site that has elevated heavy metals. Another tool is the demonstration of a low yield aquifer. We have very clay soils in many parts of Texas, and in many of those soils, a well constructed will not yield more than 150 gallons per day. If we can make that demonstration, we can relax cleanup standards by a factor of 100, which has a tremendous benefit in terms of dealing with low levels of contamination. A third tool is to develop site-specific cleanup standards. This is often done within a regulatory program. They're called Tier 1 or Tier 2 standards, and we won't get into the meat of it, but essentially you can use site-specific conditions to develop your own cleanup standards that are appropriate for your property. So if the groundwater is deep, or the soils are very clay, or other conditions or indicate that contamination might be acceptable, you can go through the process of making that demonstration in accordance with TCQ's guidelines, and then develop your own cleanup standards. So it's good to understand what those tools are and how to use them to your benefit. A fourth tool that occurs to a large degree on petroleum storage tank sites or other sites where petroleum was released is natural attenuation. Mother Nature has a great way of reducing concentrations of many organic chemicals by essentially degrading them biologically. So this process occurs naturally, but it occurs very slowly. But if we can document that it is occurring and document that there's no harm associated with the contaminated plume, in this case this would be a groundwater plume, then that is an approach that's acceptable to the state to deal with certain types of contamination. So it's a great tool that prevents you from having to clean up a groundwater plume by taking advantage of the natural biodegradation processes in the environment. And finally, plume management zones are a tool that essentially acknowledge that there is a zone of contaminated groundwater, but again, if we can show that the plume is stable in extent, it's not harming anyone, and we can do the monitoring to show that it will not harm anyone in the future, you can essentially establish a zone of groundwater contamination, acknowledge that it's there, deed restrict the property, and avoid having to do more expensive cleanup of that area.
Yikes.
Yeah, so leaking underground storage tanks, everyone's heard horror stories about leaking tanks, and many of them are true. There are many tanks leak. There are 540,000 leaking tanks reported in the United States of America. We have found that bare steel sitting in the ground for many years, especially in the presence of water, is subject to corrosion and leaking. And just to demonstrate how it doesn't take very much to create a problem, if you had a pinhole leak in an underground tank and it was leaking at a rate of 1 to 2 drops per second over a period of time, then in the course of 1 year you could lose 400 gallons of product. And that obviously leaking into the subsurface would create a significant problem.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a lot of gasoline.
A lot of gas.
Oh, next slide. So here we are in Texas. We have our own very large and significant share of reported leaking tank sites, over 28,000. Most of these are contaminated with gasoline, which has what we call the BTEX constituents. I'll try not to inundate you with environmental acronyms. BTEX is benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene, and then MTBE, which is a anti-knock agent added to gasoline. Fortunately, the leaking tank program in the state of Texas is well established, well understood, and we all know what the expectations are. And it is the prime example of using risk-based closure approaches to deal with contamination in a practical way. Essentially, if we can show that the plume is not affecting anyone, that the plume is stable in concentration, then the state of Texas will allow you to close leaking tank sites without really doing any cleanup. So in our experience, few leaking tank sites are cleaned up. They're basically studied to show environmental impacts are acceptable, and we allow Mother Nature to do the rest over time.
Because over the course of time, the gas will either
it'll degrade into more simpler carbon and ethane and compounds, and therefore no longer be harmful. That'll happen over decades or millennia, but nevertheless, it occurs. And I think we found early on that spending a lot of money trying to clean up these sites was really
because you think of a gas spill, you think yikes, but it's not that bad.
Again,
relax.
As long as no one's drinking the water, or there's no water wells nearby, or surface water receptors, then it is an acceptable approach.
Or rivers. Yeah. That would be bad, right?
Or rivers.
That would be bad.
Mm-hmm.
Did I skip one?
You skipped.
Sorry.
Yeah. Very brief. Corrective Action is a common program, but it's typically used for, I would say, spill sites or maybe industrial sites where someone already owns a property. Maybe there's not a transaction involved, and you just want to focus in on maybe a particular event, a particular waste management unit, a particular spill. At the end of a corrective action program, you will receive a no further action letter, which is some people consider a little bit squishy, but it basically says, based on what you've told us and based upon what we know, the state will require no further action at this time. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't give the strong sense of closure that one of the other programs does, but in a focused environment, depending upon the site conditions and the owner's aversion to risk and other factors, it might be a very appropriate program to use to deal with, let's say, small or localized spills.
So what's an example of something like that?
You had a spill, a diesel tank ruptures, or let's say some other chemical tank ruptures onto the ground surface, and you discover it. The next morning, someone comes up, you dig up the heavily contaminated material, you find out it's seeped down into the ground a little bit. You would go through this program to determine if you had to do any additional digging or if it had reached the groundwater table. And then you just focus in on that spill and then get closure for that particular event, so to speak.
Gotcha.
Yeah. The VCP is the most common program used to address environmental contamination outside of leaking tanks in the state of Texas. We use the phrase it's the gold standard for cleanups because at the end you receive a certificate of completion that really releases all non-responsible parties from liability for the contamination. And once you're in the VCP, it opens up all types of doors for you to use the tools that are available under the Texas Risk Reduction Program to address the contamination, again, using risk-based or site-specific approaches. So in the VCP, you can develop Tier 2 or Tier 3 cleanup levels, which are based upon your site-specific geology, depth of water. You can use modeling to demonstrate that the contamination levels are acceptable and things like that. So it's a great program to allow you to have the benefit from all of the tools available to address contamination. You can use aquifer testing, and two of the big benefits are you can use institutional or physical controls. That is, you could say that groundwater cannot be used on the site, or the site cannot be used for residential purposes, and that would allow you to relax the cleanup standard to a non-residential use. Or you could use physical controls where you could cap an area of contamination and maintain that cap over time, and therefore avoid having to clean up maybe a particular small zone of contaminated soil that otherwise is not harming anyone.
So does the VCP program, the VCP, I guess the P would be program, but the VCP, does that specifically for soil, or is that also groundwater as well?
It's for all media. It's
okay.
Soil, groundwater,
soil and groundwater.
Air.
Okay.
Right. It's but very comprehensive. It has the highest standards, and in terms of investigation and submittals and scrutiny by TCQ, the VCP will require the most amount of work, but the reward at the end is the most comprehensive release of liability. So it's well worth it, in particular for large transactions or valuable properties. The VCP is the way to go.
And the good part about the VCP is that, I mean, if you own the property, you basically will never have to do another phase 2 again, right? Or is that?
Well, as long as the ongoing operations don't use chemicals.
Don't change.
So
Okay.
obviously, if you're continuing to doing manufacturing and you have another spill release, then you have to address that as a new release. But if it's an older, I mean, let's face it, a lot of the contamination issues we're dealing with are historical from old printers or old industrial activities. If now the site's being used as a shopping mall, then clearly there's no longer ongoing industrial activity. So the benefit.
Yeah. So if I'm looking to buy a property that has a VCP on it, right? Do I even need? Do I need to do a phase 1 on that property, or do you probably, or
you probably, most lenders would require a phase 1
even with the VCP?
Just
okay.
To kind of document what's gone on and to document that the VCP addresses it all. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then that VCP is now yours too from the.
Yeah, you have the benefit of it. You're not named on it, but you have the benefit of it. Yeah.
So that is definitely a lot of value there. All right, Clay, wake up. Are you there?
I'm here.
All right. So multiple setting designation, MSDs. We like MSDs.
Yes, we do. So MSDs are basically a tool to address groundwater contamination, and they're usually done along with VCP or corrective action cases. Usually for example, a dry cleaner site may be entered into the VCP program, and then we'll use the MSD to address the groundwater contamination. So what is an MSD? It is a designation that basically restricts the use of groundwater so it cannot be used for potable purposes. So it was introduced in Texas in early 2000s, and what it is provides a more cost-effective, faster way to close out sites. For example, if you go the remediation route, it can take hundreds of thousands of dollars and many years to clean up. Whereas an MSD, generally we can get those approved in probably less than 2 years. That's depending on the municipality and the review times with the TCQ, but generally the MSD is much quicker than.
Okay, so MSD is purely groundwater, correct? But is it part of the VCP program?
It's not part of the VCP program, but it is not. The MSD is not necessarily a program; it's more of a tool to address the groundwater contamination. So typically, a site will already be entered into the VCP program or corrective action.
So I've always heard MSD, VCP. So if you get an MSD, it's not automatically a VCP, or is it? Okay.
No.
Sorry. Okay. So I own a property and I get the news groundwater is contaminated, and I probably start to cry. I'm just kidding. But then I call Clay and I say, okay, what are my options? And so to clean up, that could take a lot of money, a lot of time and effort. And then I may be stuck with that property because nobody wants to sell it when they hear that groundwater. So but what you're saying is the MSD, I'm not using that water. I don't have groundwater here in Dallas. We don't use groundwater anyway. So this is a program that says we're going to ease up on the regulations for contamination, or help me.
It basically increases the cleanup standards. That way you don't have to clean it up. There still are some standards, but there are some factors which I'll go through in the next slide. But not everyone is eligible for an MSD. For example, if you're in a rural area where there's no public or municipal water supply, or if there's drinking water wells nearby that could be impacted, you probably would not be eligible for the MSD. So it's more common in urban areas like Dallas and here in this area. So here's some of the things that you kind of want to go through and make sure you can check all these off before you actually start spending lots of money on doing the MSD. As you want to do a water well search for wells within a half-mile radius. Also, you want to make sure the municipality that your property is in has an MSD ordinance. Not all of them have that, but that's not the end of the world. We've actually helped a few municipalities develop their ordinance. But you will have to have approval from the city to put that deed restriction on your property.
And this was asked yesterday. Does all the local municipalities know about this program, or do you have to go in and say, "Hey, there's this program," and they go, "It sounds made up"? Or
No, they don't all know about it.
so you have to. So that's part of our deal is we have to go in there and teach them why this is a good program.
Correct.
Okay. Are we done with this slide?
Yes. So what the process is, you're going to do a application to the city. Once they have an ordinance, generally they'll all have a similar format, but you'll fill out the application, and there's a lot of technical requirements for it. You have to have all the data in there and do the water well searches, make sure there's not any potentially affected drinking water wells nearby. And then you submit that to the municipality. And usually their environmental people and attorneys will review that and make sure they agree with it. And then that will go to the city council. Actually, first you'll have a public meeting, and you will notify all the property owners within a half mile. And they'll have an opportunity to come to the public meeting, and we can explain what the MSD is and the contamination with that specific property. And then it will go to the city council, and if they approve it, at that point, then there's another requirement to submit notifications to all the water well owners within 5 miles. Now, in some cases, it's not very many; it's less than 100. And then in some areas, there's lots of water wells, and that can kind of increase the cost of the MSD just due to the number of well notifications that may be required. And then once everything gets approved by the city, then you do a separate application that goes to the TCQ. And then from there, they'll do a thorough review of it, make sure everything is complete, and then they'll issue a.
So, okay, so you notify everybody within a half a mile, and they have an opportunity to come to the meeting. What have been typically some of their concerns? I mean, is there ever, do people show up to these meetings, or do they, what are some of the, like when they hear MSD, contaminated water, what does that mean?
I've only been to a few of the meetings, and when I've been, there haven't been very many people show up, but a lot of them, they don't know what the acronyms are. So a lot of them, they're just there to understand what an MSD is.
Okay.
And they really don't have too many.
I'd say the biggest concern is for people who do have wells. They want to know, is there any way that this could impact my water well? That's the first. And the second one, sometimes abutting property owners will show up, and they want to know if this plume has gone onto their property and how it's going to affect their property value. That's probably the biggest question, is the people that live directly adjacent down gradient from the plume. So
okay. And so if my neighbor has a water well that they use, you're not allowed to do
you
that?
Probably wouldn't be eligible for an MSD.
Okay.
You'd have to demonstrate that well could not be affected. And sometimes that's the case because sometimes wells are much deeper than our zone of contamination. Mm-hmm. But TCQ looks at these very carefully, and I'd say if you have any wells within a quarter to a half a mile that have any potential for contamination, the TCQ will require you to pretty much find a way to document that those could not be impacted either now or in the future.
Yeah. So we don't have a lot of drinking wells here in North Texas. But there are other wells that people have that for other uses, or not really?
Yeah, but they're not as irrigation or industrial use, but they're not as high a concern. But when you get out into some of the rural areas, you can definitely have wells within that distance, and then you need to look very closely at the geohydrology and the geology, the screened intervals of the wells, et cetera, and go through that process to demonstrate to the state that it'll be okay.
So I kind of already mentioned this, but once you get all those submittals done, you will submit that second application to the TCQ, and once they do the review that Frank mentioned, they will issue a certificate, or the MSD certificate.
And now, is this certificate very similar to the MSD? So, I mean, the BCP. So once it's yours, it's yours. Now, will you never have to worry about contaminated groundwater ever again, or do you have to? Is there other things that you have to look at to see? Oh, there was a spill, but it was a different contamination that got me into the MSD program anyway. So
The MSD does not eliminate groundwater cleanup, but it relaxes, I'll use that word, relaxes the cleanup standards to such a high degree that it's very, very seldom will contamination exceed an MSD adjusted cleanup level. However, it occurs. We've had 3 sites where even with an MSD, we exceeded the cleanup levels. So it's a chemical specific and site specific, but most of the time you'll be okay, but not always. There are still some levels on highly contaminated sites that might need to be addressed. Yeah.
And this table here just shows the difference between basically the ingestion PCLs or drinking water standards for some compounds and then what it would be with an MSD. So tetrachloroethylene or PCE, that's the common dry cleaning solvent, and it goes from 0.005 to 500 milligrams per liter.
All right.
Now, some of the challenges, I've already mentioned some of these, obviously involves the local government. So you have to make sure that they have, an ordinance in place and they're aware of it. And then obviously the public participation, requires all the notifications. Another one we didn't mention was the RPUs, which is retail public utilities. You have to get their support, and it's usually not an issue, but it can add some time to it to get their input. And then MSDs generally don't include off-site properties. It's specifically usually just for the site that you're working on. But, if the contamination is going downgrading it to your neighbor's property, you can extend the MSD boundary, but you would have to have their approval to do so.
Okay.
And then just kind of the last bullet there, it does not address vapor intrusion issues, which, we're not going to go into that detail here, but that's another, potential aspect. If you do close the site and you've got really high, VOCs in the soil, another thing to think about would be vapor barriers or something.
So recap the main benefits of an MSD for me, unless you're going to get to that in a different slide.
The cost and the time, basically.
Okay.
So, reduce.
There we go.
There we go. Wow.
And even on sites.
What a segue.
Sorry. I do that a lot.
But even on sites where we do exceed the MSD levels, it may be just a small area. So instead of having to remediate the whole site, it might just be a really small area that has to be remediated. So even then, it still reduce the cost significantly.
And yeah, okay.
All right, and then the next one, innocent owner program. So what this program does is it helps owners of properties that are contaminated, but they did not cause the contamination. So, for example, let's say you've got
your neighbor has a gas station.
Yeah, your property has never been developed, or it's just an office building, and your neighbor is a dry cleaner or a gas station, and you do a phase 2, find out the groundwater underneath your site's impacted, and you would be eligible for an IOP. So what this does is it releases the property owner from liability associated with the contamination, so they don't have to clean it up. But the one thing about innocent owner certificates that is different than like the VCP is it does not cover future owners. So if you have an IOC and you sell your property down the road, the new owner would have to reapply for.
Really? Wow. So basically what this is saying that they're acknowledging that your property is contaminated, and they've verified that it's not caused by you or anything that has done with your property. They've located the cause and said, yeah, you have perk on your property, but it's not your fault. Well, okay, so here's a question. Does anybody you got this IOP, which is great, but does anybody from TCQ go to neighbor and say, Mr. Neighbor, you need to clean up all this stuff? Or is it kind of like wink, wink, sure, I'll do it?
From our experience, the state doesn't have the resources to go chasing sources of contamination. So I'm not aware of any of my IOP cases where they've gone after a suspected source site, though I'm sure there are some out there. It kind of depends on degree, but I think the TCQ project managers have too much to do already rather than, and they are not focusing on this, especially in low risk areas where groundwater is not used.
Okay. But I mean, hopefully there's certain things like, okay, if it's petroleum, where we already know that just over time that's going to kind of dissipate, out. But something like perc, that could be potentially hazardous to your health, correct?
Sure.
So that would be a bigger concern. Is there more priority on?
Yeah. Again, I think they would base it on an evaluation of what is the real risk if someone is using groundwater near that area. Maybe it's an area of the state where people do use shallow water wells, then they might do something about it. But if it's in the DFW area where everyone is using surface water reservoirs, I think it would be a very low priority to them.
All right.
So the process of obtaining an IOC is you have to submit what's called a site investigation report to the TCQ. And what it does, it basically just documents the history of the site and any investigations that have been done out there. So what it has to do is it has to show that your property did not cause or contribute to the contamination, and you have to be able to show that the contamination came from an off-site source. So most of this information can be obtained from existing phase 1 and phase 2 investigations. Let's say you don't have a formal phase 1, a lot of that information can be obtained, and if you do a historical review of sources, just put that information into the site investigation report along with the data and submit that to TCQ, and generally they'll issue the IOC.
Okay. So we're doing let's say, I guess the only really way you can know if your property is really contaminated, if your property's been affected by a spill, is doing a phase 2, which would be soil samples, right?
You do have to have data to show that it's impacted.
So just by you doing those soil samples and know, okay, well, you have petroleum, and I'm like, there's never been a gas station on this, but they're like, oh, it probably, so you would be able to say, oh, it's from across the street or down the street or wherever, just by historical phase 1s?
Some are easier than others. If it's a vacant property and you've got a dry cleaner next door and your groundwater is impacted with PCE, it's pretty obvious.
That's it, yeah.
So I think the degree of the phase 2 kind of varies from different sites, but if it's better if you have established groundwater gradient.
But if you're in a dense urban area, you're part of a city block, and your site you can demonstrate has never had a contaminative use, then there could be any number of offsite sources that are historical that you may never find the source. And the good aspect of the IOP is you do not need to identify the offsite source. You just need to show that you're impacted and that you did not cause or contribute. So,
okay, so I was in a meeting yesterday, and this property was butted up against a railroad track, and there was some stuff that even our guys said, man, we've never even seen that kind of stuff before. So, I mean, they can't pinpoint an exact time, but they know, they can probably say something from the railroad, from years of use, somehow it got over to your property. And
it all goes into basically you making the demonstration. Think of it as you being trying to make a case in a court of law.
Hopefully they
provide the evidence. What is the evidence? We have contamination at our property line. Groundwater is coming from their side to our side.
Okay, so there's some common sense and some.
It can require sometimes significant investigation to prove your innocence. But if it's worth it to you, then it's worth that investment. But it's making the case to the TCQ, making a convincing case that holds water to them, that you are not responsible.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to jump back. This is the final program we're going to speak about, and this is a program really that is not run in the private sector. This is run by TCQ's Dry Cleaner Remediation Program. If you have a qualifying dry cleaner that has had a release, then you can essentially transfer the whole investigation and cleanup, or we use the phrase response actions, over to TCQ, and they will use state funds and state contractors to investigate and complete the work at the site to eventually get a no further action letter. There are certain basic requirements to this. You have to have paid at least $5,000 in deductible in either past or ongoing costs for consulting, etc. And if you have not been a registered dry cleaning facility, you must back pay registration and penalty fees, which can add up to quite a bit, but The benefits are essentially you will hand the site over to the state and they will take it from there. We have found that obviously due to limited resources and prioritization of sites, the TCQ is wisely spending money on those sites with the greatest risk. And so some sites that are in low-risk areas will not have very much done to them until those high-risk sites are addressed. So it can take a long time. You can anticipate that you will be in this program for many, many years before you receive a closure.
Yeah, and there was a saying that once you're in, you can't get out or something like that.
Well, if you use state funds to investigate the site and then you decide you wanted to clean it up.
Oh, I remember what was it. It's like that old song from the Eagles. You can check out, but you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave, or something like that. Okay, here's my question. If you're into that program, can you sell your property?
Yes.
Okay, and that transferable to
the new owner would have to agree to all the terms and conditions of the DCRP with the state, so they'd have to enter into essentially an access agreement with the state.
Is it more restrictive? Is it better? Or is it a good program?
Well,
or
the state the state decides what the cleanup standard will be. So technically, I think that means the owner is stuck with whatever the state decides. So if they put a physical or an institutional control on your property, and that's part of the closure, then you will have to live with it if you accept it. So it might not be something you would have done if you did it yourself, but the state will look for obviously the most cost-efficient way to get closure. So you're giving up a little bit of, I think,
control.
A little bit of control, but the benefits are they're spending the money and you're not.
That's good, yeah. But if I came to you and I had a dry cleaner, what would you?
It's entirely on, if you're going to hold on to the site for the next 10 years, let the state do it. If you think you might need to sell it off for any reason before then you might want to think about it.
Okay. And okay, so is it hard to get into that program? Not really.
No.
Okay.
No. Okay. We've reached the end.
Y'all did really good.
We've gone through a lot of stuff and a number of programs, another number of discussions about various ways to deal with contamination. I guess the big messages are that the program requirements will vary. Voluntary cleanup versus petroleum storage tank versus IOP and dry cleaner. And that risk-based decisions, risk-based considerations are, in our mind, key to making smart cleanup decisions. We think there are many tools available to us, if used wisely, can save a lot of money and time in terms of dealing with cleanup. MSD being the most obvious to me and the one that we have found to be the most valuable over the recent 5 to 6 years, but also other tools to Tier 1, Tier 2, Class 3 aquifer, etc. So be aware of what those are. Have your consultant evaluate them all so that you can use the best program, best tools for you, and then just be aware of all those tools and what they can do and how you can use them. Things such as institutional and physical controls. If you can live with a cap on contaminated soil, for example, you can avoid expensive disposal of soil to landfill. You can isolate part of your site to have that for commercial use and be a parking lot, and the rest of the site can be used for residential stuff like that. So many ways to skin the cat.
A lot of options.
A lot of options, and be available. Don't despair. There are ways to deal with these issues that will not necessarily break the bank.
And okay, I do have a question from the audience. Any concerns regarding homeowner septic tanks? Don't let it leak.
Typically, septic tanks that are used just for residential use are not generally considered a wreck or a concern. It's been well documented that septic systems and Mother Nature is very good at removing generally bacterial contaminants out of septic releases. So unless there's chemicals going into a septic system, which maybe a septic system associated with an industrial facility, but for residential developments, if we found a septic system, we would not consider it a wreck that requires investigation.
Okay. Another one. Do you have a similar blog presentation for Tier 1 and Tier 2 evaluation. Yes, we do have tier 1 and tier 2 blogs on our web.
No, you're
am I thinking something different?
Talking about tier 1 reporting.
Sorry. See?
Yeah. No, we have not done one. Those are kind of technical. I think the average person would have a hard time following them because you're getting into, coefficients of dispersivity and KD and FOE, all types of highly technical terms. I'm not sure the average reader would or listener would be able to stay with it or whatever. But if someone wants to contact us and talk about tier 1, tier 2, we'd be glad to try to help them out individually.
Okay. Last question. Have you ever had a real estate transaction complicated by an environmental contamination? I mean, yeah.
That was really a question for the audience, but I was just curious how many people listening would have had to deal with this type of issue, I guess, and obviously.
Gotcha.
We don't have a slide to get answers on that, but
all right. Well,
I certainly have been involved in lots of them.
Fine. I guess our communication needs to be a little brush up on our pre-com webinar. So, well, that was a great webinar. A lot of great information. Thank you, Frank and Clay, for that. And if you guys have any questions or concerns or properties that you wanted to have ask questions about, and you have an environmental concern, you want to get in some of these programs, there's Clay and Frank's contact information, and they will be more than happy to answer all your questions. Our next webinar is spill response preparation. Not all spills are equal, with Austin Hyder. We're going to be down in Houston. We're going to be on a traveling show, and that's going to be August 22nd. It's the last Thursday of every month, in case anybody was just ever wondering, that's when I do them. So great time. Thank you guys for your time and your knowledge and your enthusiasm. I appreciate it. So have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone.
Talk to you soon.